The day the HOA shut down my kid's lemonade stand was the day I realized you don't mess with a parent's right to defend their child, especially when that parent owns half the neighborhood. Have you ever been told that something so innocent, so pure, could break the rules of a neighborhood? A simple gesture, a child trying to make a few bucks with their homemade lemonade stand, could be considered a violation? What would you do if you were told that your child's harmless attempt to make some pocket money was causing a disruption to the community? Would you roll over and accept it, or would you do something about it? I didn't roll over. My name is Matt Williams, and I've lived in the same neighborhood for over a decade. I'm the kind of person who believes in fairness. I believe in teaching my children that the world isn't as bad as people sometimes make it out to be. And as a small business owner, I also believe in the importance of hard work, hustle, and doing things for yourself. So when my daughter, Emma, decided to set up a lemonade stand at the end of our driveway, I was all for it. She'd been saving up for a new bike, and I thought this was a perfect opportunity for her to learn a valuable lesson in entrepreneurship. But the story didn't go quite as I expected. It all started on a sunny Saturday morning. Emma, with her little apron on, had set up a small table, and her sign read, "Fresh lemonade, $1." Her lemonade was homemade, and she had even gotten her younger brother, Max, to help her out by waving at passing cars. They were both beaming with excitement. There was nothing wrong with what they were doing. Nothing at all. I was inside the house, working on my laptop, when I heard a knock at the door. I opened it to find a stern-looking woman standing on the porch, her arms crossed, wearing the typical HOA uniform, a buttoned-up shirt, khaki pants, and a clipboard in her hand. It was Karen Wellington, the self-appointed enforcer of every rule in the neighborhood. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice polite but firm. "I'm afraid you're in violation of neighborhood rules." "Sorry, what?" I asked, confused. "Your daughter's lemonade stand. It's a commercial activity. According to Section 4, Paragraph 3 of the HOA bylaws, no commercial activity is permitted without prior approval." I blinked. "Commercial activity? It's a lemonade stand, Karen. A lemonade stand." She didn't flinch. "I'm afraid it doesn't matter. It's a violation of the rules, and I'm going to have to ask you to take it down. Immediately." My jaw dropped. "Are you serious? My daughter is just trying to make a little money by selling lemonade. That's it. I'm not turning this into some corporate enterprise." Karen didn't respond to that. She just stared at me with a cold, clinical look in her eyes. "The rules are the rules, Mr. Williams. If you don't take it down, you'll be fined. And if it happens again, we'll escalate the issue." I stood there, stunned. I had heard about Karen's rule enforcement before. She was the type who walked around with a list of bylaws in her hand, looking for reasons to impose fines and make people's lives miserable. But this was absurd. It was a lemonade stand. Before I could say anything else, she turned and walked away, making sure to mark something on her clipboard as she went. I couldn't believe it. A simple, innocent act of childhood enterprise was being crushed by the cold hand of bureaucracy. I stood on the porch for a long moment, staring at the empty space where Emma's stand had been. I could hear the faint sound of Emma's disappointed voice as she tried to understand why someone would take down her table, why her simple idea had been stopped by an adult with no sense of humor or perspective. I could hear Max, too, asking her why they had to stop selling their lemonade. And in that moment, something inside me snapped. I was angry. I was angry at Karen, at the HOA, and at the unfairness of it all. But more than that, I was angry that they were trying to stop my kids from learning a lesson, learning the value of hard work, of doing something for themselves. They were trying to take away an opportunity, and I wasn't going to stand for it. The next day, I drove over to the HOA office. I had seen Karen earlier in the morning, strolling down the street with a satisfied look on her face as if she had just done something righteous. But I wasn't going to let that stand. No, it was time for me to take action, not just for Emma, but for every parent, every child, and every homeowner who had been subjected to Karen's iron-fisted rule. I parked my car outside the HOA office, stepping out with purpose. I was tired of Karen's meddling. I was tired of the HOA's arbitrary and pointless regulations. I was done letting them tell me what I could and couldn't do in my own neighborhood. As I walked into the office, I couldn't help but smile to myself. This was it. This was where I was going to make my stand. Inside the office, a few of the HOA members were gathered around a conference table discussing what else, rules and fines. They all looked up when I entered, surprised to see me there. "Mr. Williams," one of them, a man named Greg, said with a raised eyebrow. "What can we do for you?" "I'm here to talk about your ridiculous rule enforcement, Greg," I said, my voice calm but firm. "You can start by removing the fine you placed on my daughter's lemonade stand." Greg raised his hands in a gesture of defense. "I'm afraid there's nothing we can do, Mr. Williams. The rules are clear. If you want to sell lemonade, you need approval." "Yeah, well," I said, "I've had enough. It's time for you to learn the rules." I didn't give them a chance to speak. I was already formulating a plan, and it was going to involve far more than just getting Emma's lemonade stand reinstated. I wasn't going to let this go. I wasn't going to let a bunch of bylaws dictate how I raised my kids or what we did in our own home. I left the HOA office that day with a clear idea in mind. If they thought they could mess with me and my kids, they were wrong. I wasn't going to just stop at the lemonade stand. I was going to take control of the neighborhood. All of it. By the time I got back to my car, I was already calculating how I could do it. It wasn't enough to just fight for my kids' lemonade stand. No, I was going to prove a point to the HOA. I was going to buy up every single property on the block, and I was going to own the entire area. The HOA couldn't tell me what to do if they didn't have any control left. And so, my mission began. I would buy every house on the block, one by one. The HOA's rules would no longer apply. I would show them what it meant to mess with someone who had the means and the determination to fight back. What started as a simple dispute over a lemonade stand was now about to turn into a battle for the very control of the neighborhood. It didn't take long for my plan to fall into place. What had begun as a simple dispute over my daughter's lemonade stand had morphed into something far larger. I wasn't just fighting for my child anymore. I was fighting for the entire neighborhood. A neighborhood that had been under the thumb of an oppressive HOA for far too long. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how deeply entrenched the HOA was in the lives of every resident here. They weren't just policing property lines and lawns. They were dictating the very fabric of life in this community. I drove home that evening, my mind racing. I had a few options in front of me, and I needed to figure out the best way to start. How could I not only win this fight for my family, but also expose how deeply corrupt and overbearing this HOA really was? As I pulled into my driveway, I saw Emma and Max sitting on the porch, playing with sidewalk chalk. They looked up at me when I got out of the car, their faces full of curiosity. "Dad, are we going to get to sell lemonade again tomorrow?" Emma asked, her innocent excitement making me feel even more determined to show her what it meant to stand up for what's right. I smiled at her, even though the situation was far from resolved. "We're going to fix this, kiddo. Don't worry." That night, after dinner, I sat down with my laptop and started researching. The first thing I needed was a clear understanding of the rules the HOA had put in place and how far they could legally go. I pulled up the HOA's official documents and began digging through the bylaws and regulations. Sure enough, I found more than just the ridiculous commercial activity rule they had used to shut down Emma's lemonade stand. I found dozens of rules that were arbitrary, invasive, and designed to give the HOA control over nearly every aspect of residents' lives. The first one that caught my eye was the external decor clause. Homeowners had to submit their plans for any exterior renovations or decorations, including things like seasonal displays or even mailboxes, for approval. It wasn't just about keeping the neighborhood aesthetically pleasing. It was about giving the HOA power over personal expression. There were rules about fences, the color of paint on your house, even the kind of grass you could grow. If a homeowner wanted to make a change to their property, whether it was a simple paint job or a new mailbox, they had to get the HOA's approval first. This meant that for every simple upgrade, people were at the mercy of the HOA board's mood that day. I kept reading, each section revealing more about the HOA's stranglehold on the neighborhood. It was systematic control, dressed up as community management. It wasn't just about enforcing rules for the sake of order. It was about keeping the residents in check and making sure no one stepped out of line. People had been paying fines for years for petty violations, for not trimming their hedges exactly to specification, or for parking their cars in a place the HOA deemed inappropriate. The fines added up quickly, and residents often felt powerless to challenge them. But the more I read, the more I began to see that the HOA's reign of terror wasn't just about property rights. It was about the money. The HOA collected dues from homeowners every month, and they used that money to fund their operations, pay for their administrative staff, and in some cases pay off their own legal battles when they were sued for overstepping their bounds. This wasn't just about controlling the look of the neighborhood. It was about control over residents' pocketbooks. The fines, the fees for approved contractors, the mandatory service charges for common area maintenance. Everything had a hidden cost. It wasn't just about creating a community. It was about creating a cash cow for the HOA board members and their associates. I realized then that I wasn't just fighting for my daughter's lemonade stand. This was bigger than that. I was fighting against a deeply entrenched system of control and manipulation. The HOA wasn't just meddling in people's lives. It was running a scheme designed to enrich itself at the expense of the people who lived here. And I had no intention of letting that stand. I made a decision that night. I wasn't just going to buy a few properties around the neighborhood. I was going to buy the whole block, every single house. I would take ownership, slowly but surely, until the HOA's ability to enforce their tyrannical rules was gone. No one could tell me what I could do with my property, and no one could tell Emma that she couldn't set up a lemonade stand in front of our house. But I wasn't just thinking of my family. I was thinking of everyone in the neighborhood who had been paying the price for the HOA's overreach. I was thinking of the families who had been fined for ridiculous reasons, the retirees who had been forced to sell their homes because they couldn't afford the growing fees, the young families who were discouraged from adding their personal touches to their homes. I was thinking of all of them. The next morning, I made my first move. I drove over to the local real estate office and started looking into properties for sale in the neighborhood. I knew that the HOA would be watching the properties that came on the market, but I didn't care. I was about to turn the tables. I was going to buy properties without drawing too much attention to myself. I didn't need the HOA to know I was behind the purchases. Not yet, anyway. I put in offers on 3 properties right away. They weren't the biggest homes in the neighborhood, but they were in prime locations. Close enough to mine to give me the control I needed, but not too expensive that they would attract immediate suspicion. The first house I bought had been sitting on the market for months, a quiet fixer-upper that had been ignored by most buyers. The second was a smaller property with an overgrown lawn, and the third was a slightly larger home that needed some minor renovations. I knew the HOA would be upset when they found out, but they weren't going to know it was me pulling the strings. I was going to buy this neighborhood piece by piece. I was going to control the very thing they had been using to control everyone, the homes. It wasn't long before I started hearing rumblings from the HOA. The letters started arriving in my mailbox, warnings about my suspicious behavior, and reminders about the HOA's rules and regulations. They were trying to intimidate me, but it didn't work. In fact, it only fueled my determination. I started making more offers, more purchases. I wasn't buying for the sake of real estate investment, I was buying for power. The more properties I acquired, the more control I had. And then, just when I thought I was making progress. Something unexpected happened. I got a call from Karen Wellington. "Mr. Williams," she said, her tone colder than usual. "We need to talk." The call from Karen Wellington wasn't a surprise. It was inevitable. The moment I started buying properties in the neighborhood, I knew it was only a matter of time before the HOA would take notice. But I didn't expect the conversation to go the way it did. As soon as I picked up the phone, I could hear her voice, rigid and authoritative, though with a hint of hesitation. "Mr. Williams, I think we need to have a serious discussion about your recent activities in the neighborhood," Karen began, her words clipped. "You've been making a lot of purchases, and frankly, it's raising some concerns." I leaned back in my chair, setting my cup of coffee aside, a smirk tugging at the corner of my mouth. She was rattled, and I could hear it. "I'm just a homeowner, Karen," I said calmly. "What's the problem?" "Oh, don't play coy," she snapped. "You've been buying up properties left and right, and you know as well as I do that that's a clear violation of our guidelines. You're intentionally disrupting the stability of this neighborhood." I let out a short, humorless laugh. "Disrupting stability?" "Karen, last time I checked, I'm allowed to buy a house if I want to. The HOA doesn't own the real estate here, you know." There was a long pause on the other end, then she responded in a low, almost dangerous tone. "We're not talking about real estate transactions, Mr. Williams. We're talking about your intentions. You're intentionally undermining the authority of the HOA." Her words were an attempt at intimidation, but it didn't work. I wasn't backing down. In fact, the more she spoke, the clearer it became that I was on the right path. They had no idea what they were up against. "Is that a threat, Karen?" I asked. "Because if it is, I have a lawyer who'll be more than happy to speak with you." She didn't respond immediately. Instead, there was the sound of papers shuffling, probably her trying to find something to defend herself with. "We'll be monitoring your purchases closely," she said finally. "If you continue this, you will face significant consequences. We're not going to let you take control of this neighborhood." I could tell she was bluffing. This wasn't the first time an HOA had tried to stop a resident from expanding or taking control, but this was the first time it had been me they were dealing with. I wasn't afraid. If anything, I was energized. The thought of taking control, of finally standing up to this organization that had ruled the neighborhood for far too long, was too satisfying to let it slip away. "I think you should worry about your consequences, Karen," I said coolly, letting her know I wasn't backing down. "Because if you keep pushing this, you won't just have to deal with me. You'll have to deal with the people I represent, the very people your HOA has been trying to control for years." Before she could respond, I hung up. There was no more time to waste. I had to act, and I had to act quickly. If the HOA thought they could intimidate me with empty threats, they were sorely mistaken. The first step in my plan was clear. I needed to buy more properties. At this point, I owned a handful of homes. But the HOA didn't know how much control I had. If I could keep buying quietly without drawing too much attention to myself, the HOA wouldn't know what hit them. Once I had enough of the block under my ownership, I would use that power to force a change, something that would make the HOA powerless. I set out immediately. By the end of the week, I had placed bids on 5 more properties. I was moving fast, and I wasn't leaving anything to chance. I wasn't just buying homes, I was buying influence. As I signed contracts and made payments, I could feel the power shifting in my favor. Each new property was another piece of leverage in a larger game, and I was winning. The HOA might have been monitoring me, but they didn't know the full extent of my moves. By the time the second week rolled around, I had already become something of a quiet presence in the neighborhood. My name was beginning to circulate, whispered behind closed doors by residents who were aware of the changes happening. But I wasn't just acquiring properties. I was building relationships. I had talked to a few of the neighbors, people who had been in the community for years, and I knew they were tired. Tired of the constant rules, tired of the fines, tired of the oppression. The more I spoke to people, the more I realized just how deep the HOA's control went. People had been too afraid to speak out, too afraid of what would happen if they challenged Karen and her board. But the more I heard their stories, the more I realized I wasn't just fighting for my own family. I was fighting for all of them. One night, I called a few of the key residents together. We met at a local diner, away from the prying eyes of the HOA, and I laid out my plan. "We're going to take this neighborhood back," I said to them, looking each of them in the eye. "The HOA has been running this place like their own personal kingdom, but we're going to change that. I'm not just buying houses, I'm buying freedom." The looks on their faces were a mix of surprise and disbelief, but I could see the hope in their eyes, too. They had been living under the thumb of the HOA for so long, they had almost forgotten what it felt like to fight for their rights. "I'll do whatever it takes," said Jim, a local contractor who lived 2 houses down. "I've had enough of this HOA crap. I'm with you." Over the next few days, more neighbors joined in. We began organizing quietly, working together to buy up the remaining properties in the block. Some of the residents took out loans, others sold off investments, and we all contributed in one way or another. It wasn't just about money, it was about taking back what was rightfully ours. But the HOA wasn't going to let us get away with it without a fight. I had been expecting this. As I made my final purchase on a large property that had been empty for years, I received another letter from Karen Wellington, this time with a much more aggressive tone. The letter was long-winded, filled with legal jargon, but the message was clear. "If you continue this purchasing spree, Mr. Williams, we will take you to court. You are violating our community guidelines and endangering the value of this neighborhood. Your actions are not only illegal, but detrimental to everyone around you." I read through the letter, my mind already working on my next move. I wasn't afraid of her threats. I was prepared to take this to court if I had to. But I wasn't, just going to play defense. I was going to go on the offensive. The time had come to expose Karen and the HOA for what they really were, a system built on greed and power, not community. I called Ruth, my attorney, and told her to prepare for battle. "I want to file a public lawsuit," I said. "I want to take the HOA down, and I want the world to know what they've been doing to people." Ruth agreed, and we set the wheels in motion. The public exposure would be the final piece of the puzzle. Once the community saw the corruption for what it was, Karen and her board would have no choice but to surrender. Their control would vanish in an instant. The day I walked into the courtroom, I knew it was the beginning of the end for the HOA. I had been preparing for this moment for weeks, compiling evidence, strategizing, and meeting with my attorney, Ruth, to ensure that we had everything in place. The lawsuit I had filed wasn't just a legal battle, it was a statement that said enough. Enough of Karen Wellington's overreach, enough of the oppressive bylaws, and enough of the HOA's constant interference in the lives of people just trying to live in peace. I stood in the lobby of the courthouse, waiting for the session to start. Ruth was by my side, her usual calm demeanor unwavering, but even she couldn't hide the excitement in her eyes. We both knew this. It wasn't just about a fight for justice. It was about something far bigger. A fight for the rights of every resident who had been oppressed by the HOA's tyrannical rule. I could hear the faint murmur of voices as people filed into the courtroom. On the other side, I could see Karen Wellington and the rest of the HOA board members sitting at their table, looking nervous and fidgeting with their papers. I smiled to myself. They were used to controlling everything with fear, with intimidation, but now the tables had turned. They weren't the ones with the power anymore. As the court session began, the judge, a stern-looking man with a thick beard and glasses, called the case to order. His voice rang out with authority as he addressed the room. "We are here today to hear the case of Williams versus Lakeside HOA," the judge said, looking over his glasses at the opposing side. "Mr. Williams, please present your case." I stood, up and walked to the front of the courtroom, my heart pounding in my chest, but my mind as clear as ever. This wasn't the time for hesitation. This was the time to show them exactly what they had done to our neighborhood, to our homes, and to our lives. I took a deep breath and began. Your Honor, I stand here today not just for my family, but for every resident in this community who has suffered under the control of the Lakeside HOA. The HOA's actions have not only been illegal, but they have caused countless families to live in fear and uncertainty. For years, they have imposed arbitrary rules, unjust fines, and have manipulated the system to enrich themselves while stifling the dreams of the people they were supposed to serve. I paused, letting my words sink in. The room was silent, all eyes on me. Even Karen and the board members were no longer looking as smug as they had when they entered the courtroom. I could see the shift, the fear that had started to creep in, the eye. HOA claims they're protecting the community, I continued, but all they've done is suppress it. They've taken homeowners' hard-earned money in the form of fines for things like having a mailbox that isn't the right shade of green, or for trimming a hedge just slightly too tall. They've used their power to intimidate anyone who dared to challenge them. And I'm here to say that this stops now. I turned to face Karen and the board members. They were visibly uncomfortable, shifting in their seats, their faces pale as they realized the weight of what I was saying. The reason I'm here today, I said, is because I didn't just sit back and accept their rules. I decided to fight. I started buying up properties in this neighborhood, not for profit, but for power. The power to show the HOA that they couldn't just control people with their fear. I bought this neighborhood not to destroy it, but to save it, to restore it to the people who live here, people like me, people like my neighbors. I paused for a moment to let my words sink in, then turned back to the judge. Your Honor, I have gathered all the evidence needed to prove that the HOA's practices have been illegal and harmful to the residents of this community. I have documented their discriminatory actions, their manipulative behavior, and their blatant disregard for the law. I ask the court to rule in my favor and put an end to this reign of control. Ruth stood beside me, ready to present the documents that backed up everything I had said. She laid out the evidence, showing the history of fines, the countless complaints from residents, and the numerous zoning violations the HOA had overlooked or ignored for their own gain. With each piece of evidence we presented, the atmosphere in the room shifted further. The HOA, once so confident in their power, now looked weak, desperate, and exposed. Karen Wellington stood up to speak. Her voice, usually so cold and confident, now trembled slightly as she tried to defend the HOA's actions. Your Honor, Mr. Williams is misrepresenting the situation, she said, her tone defensive. The HOA's regulations are in place to ensure that the neighborhood remains a safe, attractive, and cohesive community. Mr. Williams has been buying up properties for personal gain, and we're concerned about the long-term effects of this. This is not a fight for fairness. This is a power grab. The room fell silent. Her words hung in the air, but they didn't carry the weight they once did. People in the room were no longer swayed by her arguments. They had seen the truth. They had heard the stories of residents who had been bullied into compliance, the stories of families who had been threatened for trivial reasons. They were finally beginning to understand the extent of the HOA's control. The judge listened carefully to both sides, his face impassive as he reviewed the evidence. After what felt like an eternity, he finally spoke. Mr. Williams, he said, looking directly at me, I believe you have made your case. The actions of the HOA as presented here today are indeed troubling. They have overstepped their boundaries, manipulated the system, and caused unnecessary hardship to the residents of this neighborhood. Karen's face was ashen as she realized what was happening. The HOA was losing. They were losing badly. The judge turned to Karen and the other board members. The court rules that the Lakeside HOA is in violation of the law. The practices you have engaged in, including the manipulation of property values and the unfair fines imposed on homeowners, will not stand. The HOA is hereby dissolved, and a new system of community governance will be implemented. I could barely believe what I was hearing. The HOA was being dissolved. It was over. The reign of fear and control was coming to an end. The judge continued with his ruling. Additionally, he said, Mr. Williams, as the individual who brought this case forward and has demonstrated the HOA's illegal activities, you will be granted control over the properties you have acquired in the area. You will also be responsible for organizing a new community governance structure, one that reflects the needs and desires of the residents. The room erupted in a mixture of applause and cheers from the people who had gathered to support me. The residents who had been beaten down by the HOA's power were now witnessing the end of that tyranny. They were finally free. I looked over at Karen and the board members. They were defeated, their heads down, knowing they had lost. I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. I had done it. We had done it. We had taken back what was ours. As the court session ended and the crowd began to disperse, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The battle was over, but the work was just beginning. The neighborhood was mine now, not in the literal sense, but in a way that meant something far more important. I was going to help rebuild this community, to create a place where families could thrive, where people didn't have to live in fear of being fined for trivial matters. I walked out of the courtroom with my head held high. I had fought for my family. I had fought for the community. And most importantly, I had fought for the freedom of everyone who had ever felt powerless in the face of bureaucracy. The work ahead would be challenging. There would be new hurdles to overcome, new battles to fight. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were finally on the right path. As I left the courthouse, I looked up at the sky. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the city. It was a symbol of the new beginning that lay ahead.